Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. Hello again, I'm Paul Barter, your host. Today I want to talk about a topic in urban transport that doesn't get enough attention. If you're someone who cares about public transport in your city and you're pushing to improve it, you really need to get your head around the various options for organising and regulating public transport. I'm going to talk mainly about buses today, but some of these concepts apply to other kinds of public transport as well. Now, this topic often gets framed around the question of privatisation or government operation, but actually the topic is much more complicated than that, but also much more interesting than that, as we'll see. And what I'm going to try to do in this episode is fairly briefly, fairly quickly, acquaint you with the key choices and some examples and give you a sense of what's at stake. I'm not going to dig really deeply into the pros and cons of the different alternatives. That will have to wait for some other episode. So it'll be a gallop through the alternatives and a framework for thinking about them. This is important because how decisions get made on urban public transport, on the bus system, make a big difference for things you care about. Things like coordination, service levels, how the goals are set and what goals are decided upon, and, for example, how ambitious the bus system is going to be about serving excellent public transport in your city. It's not as simple as simply a market's good, government's bad, or government's good, market's bad kind of an argument. It's actually much more interesting than that. Let's start with a familiar option. Many of you are probably familiar with cities where public transport and bus service in particular is run by some kind of state-owned entity. A state-owned enterprise, a municipal bus operator, a transit authority that's government-owned by some level of government or some combination. So this is actually common in the United States still. Some Indian cities have this, some Chinese cities, some Russian cities. It's common. And it has been even more common in the past in Western Europe and Australia than it is now. And of course, it's been criticised by some. So some of that criticism is sometimes fair, sometimes it's not fair. So when people are proposing some kind of alternative to public monopoly, public transport, they'll often talk in terms of privatisation, but you need to ask, what do they mean by privatisation? In fact, the term privatisation when it comes to bus systems is almost meaningless because there are so many alternative ways to organise a bus system that involve private sector operators. So which one are they proposing? It really matters. They're very, very different. Let's look at one example, the extreme example of deregulation. In the case of the UK, this deregulation wasn't quite as extreme as we find in other parts of the world, in that only reasonably established corporate bus operators were allowed because you had to publish a timetable. There were certain restrictions. So it wasn't completely open entry. Other parts of the world, we find an even more extreme kind of deregulation, or in many cases, it's never been regulated. So deregulation may be not quite the right word. A city like Metro Manila has thousands of tiny businesses running 1, 2, 3 jeepneys with extremely light regulation. The licensing is on a vehicle-by-vehicle basis rather than for the companies. And they more or less go where they see a market for themselves. The former Soviet Union often has this kind of minibus service. All across Africa, some Latin American countries also have this. In Kenya, they're known as matatus. In South Africa, they're known as minibus taxis. There's different names all over the world. Historically, Singapore had this between about 1910 and 1935 in the area beyond the reach of the trolleybuses, which had a different regulatory approach. All across the Western world, there were jitneys, which were these unregulated minibus operators. San Francisco, Los Angeles, Melbourne, and many other cities had them. They often operated beyond the reach of the trams or streetcars, like in the Singapore case, and they often actually competed with the trams and streetcars, and this actually then eventually led to some regulation. So if you've got a government that's not capable of organising an effective public transport system, then an unregulated system is certainly better than nothing. But if you have higher ambitions for your public transport, this kind of operation does have some serious drawbacks. It tends to crowd into the most lucrative, most high-demand areas and the high-demand times and neglect other times. There's often bad behaviour like racing. So, as I said, people pushing to privatise public monopoly bus systems might mean privatisation and deregulation. They might mean allowing completely open entry, even by small players like in developing countries. But more likely, they may mean a UK-style deregulation, although these days that style of privatisation has a bad reputation because of the experience of what happened in the UK and in certain other countries where that was tried, such as New Zealand. The results were good in the sense of lower costs per bus kilometre, etc., but the results in terms of providing a coordinated and well-run regular service for passengers were mostly bad. But as I said, I don't want to get too much into the evaluations of these issues. Now, another option, which will probably be relatively unfamiliar for most people in the Western world, but may be familiar to people in other parts of the world. This is the idea of franchises. The idea here is of a regulated monopoly, either on a corridor-by-corridor basis or maybe for whole areas, and in some places for the whole city, usually for small cities. So you give a contract to a private company to run buses. The bus operators in this case are allowed to take some initiative to make changes. They can change the lines, maybe with permission. They usually have exclusive rights. It's a monopoly, but the quid pro quo there is that the fares are regulated. The operators are taking the risk, the business risk, the revenue risk. They collect the fares, but if things go badly, they lose money. Usually there will be some kind of service obligations. The government will say to the operators, okay, you must run a certain amount of service. That's the deal. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Franchises can work pretty well and be a fairly stable option. They worked very well in Singapore between about 1974 and quite recently. They've worked very well in Hong Kong for many, many years. They work quite well, I believe, in quite a few of the medium-sized and small cities in the Netherlands and in France. So long as the government pays some attention and takes those service obligations seriously and puts the contract up for tender every now and then, or at least has the threat of that if the operations go badly, then this can be quite a good option. It's not necessarily going to provide ambitious public transport because since the operators are taking the revenue risk, usually they are pretty risk averse. So that's one sort of limitation of this option. But when governments don't pay much attention and don't take the service obligations very seriously, don't really monitor the service and make sure that the operations are doing well, this can all go wrong. It can end up in a slow spiral downwards. So, for example, I mentioned Singapore as a success of this, but that success was the aftermath of a long, slow failure of something similar. So between 1935 and 1974, Singapore, broadly speaking, had franchises, corridor-by-corridor franchises for bus service, but the government didn't monitor the service obligations seriously. All it did was control the fares. So there were regulated fares, but the government was more or less ignoring the bus system and hoping for the best. The government was assuming that the regulated monopoly bus operators would do fine if they were just left to their own devices. And that was true for some time, but as the regulated fares fell behind costs and as competition from cars and motorcycles increased, there was a downward spiral, and the government was reluctant to agree to fare increases because the service was becoming horrible. And how could a government agree to increase the fares when the service is so horrible? And so you end up in a catch-22 vicious cycle situation. That Singapore example has is just one of many very, very similar stories. There's a famous Harvard Kennedy School of Government case study about Sri Lanka, and a very similar story of how the franchised bus operators there also had a similar downward spiral. Ken William wrote about this kind of situation in Caribbean bus services in the 1970s and 80s, I believe. So if you're going to have a regulated monopoly bus system, you need to pay attention. The government needs to have serious service obligations monitored, and the fares can be regulated, but you're going to either need to allow them to rise in line with costs, or if you don't do that, you're going to need to subsidize and make sure that you pay attention. Is the service running as it's supposed to? So bottom line here, I make a distinction here between well-regulated franchises and what I call passive franchises, which is a recipe for problems. One variation on what can go wrong with a passive franchise is that it can slide into some kind of deregulation by default. For example, in Bogota, before some recent reforms, the private sector buses used to, on paper, be franchised. There were companies with licenses to operate buses on a set of lines, but most of those companies in practice didn't actually own or run any buses. What they did was to subcontract, and the government was paying so little attention to what was actually going on that this subcontracting reached the extremes that it was subcontracted down to individual bus crews, drivers and conductors who were running the buses and paying the license owners a daily fee. So this is almost the same as deregulation. And it had all of the similar problems and issues that a deregulated bus system has. That's a common story at various times in various Latin American cities. So, for example, Santiago de Chile had a bus system like that in a certain period in its history, I think in the 1970s. Hong Kong is a good example of well-regulated bus franchises. There are several companies that operate buses, and they have 10-year contracts, so there's competitive tendering at the end of those contracts. And each company serves a set of routes. But they have some autonomy to modify them. They have to submit a 5-year forward planning program each year with proposals for service improvements and or rationalisation, and there's some negotiation with government to on those changes. The government strictly enforces service obligations to make sure the operators provide decent service. But the companies are taking the revenue risk. The money stays with the companies, and they are the ones taking the business risk. I mentioned Singapore as a case that had well-regulated franchises until recently, but over the last few years, Singapore has been jumping into yet another alternative that we haven't mentioned yet. This alternative will be familiar to listeners in Western Europe, probably, Londoners, and also people in Australia and New Zealand, where we have transport authorities who are doing the planning. So government is taking even more responsibility than in the franchised alternative. Government sets up an authority of some kind to plan and organise the bus system, but the services themselves are run by private sector operators. So in the West, in places like Scandinavia, in London, in Australia, this situation has usually been reached via privatisation. So when we say privatisation to people from that part of the world, they'll be thinking about this alternative, usually. On the other hand, Singapore has reached this situation from the opposite direction. Singapore had a franchise arrangement where the bus operators actually were more or less doing their own bus service planning, albeit with some collaboration with government. But at a certain point, the Singapore government decided it needed more control. It wanted to be more ambitious with the bus system, and it's shifted to the system where the Land Transport Authority now is the bus system planner. And this is happening in various other parts of the world as well. Delhi has been trying to shift to something like this arrangement. Bogota and several other Colombian cities and Latin American cities have also been shifting to this kind of arrangement where with government planning but service contracts. In Bogota's case, the jury is still out. Will this be considered a success in the long run? So just to summarise, this arrangement, I call it proactive planning with service contracts. There's a public transport authority, plans all the services, sometimes even the schedules. That requires some institutional capacity, of course. The services are procured from the private sector through competitive tenders. And in this case, it's usually the public sector authority that takes the revenue risk. So we call that gross cost contracts. Moscow in Russia is another example of a bus system that I believe has recently shifted to this arrangement. Seoul's famous 2004 semi-public bus reforms were along these lines. Before that, Seoul had what I think would qualify as a passive franchise system. There were many bus operators, and the government wasn't particularly paying attention to their level of service and to their quality. There was a lot of unhappiness, and the bus operators were spiraling downwards as their cost structures were deteriorating, the familiar story that I mentioned before. And so in 2004, the Seoul government took charge. So it was semi-public in the sense that the city government set up a transport authority to plan and manage the buses, and the private sector bus companies were the ones to actually operate those services on a gross cost basis, on a contract basis. The plan was to have competitive tendering, but in practice that hasn't happened yet, and that's one of the perhaps downsides of the Seoul case. They were meant to follow through with competitive tendering, and they haven't yet done that. So one of the claimed benefits of this particular alternative is that you can get the best of both worlds. Government doing planning and coordination, that is a strength of government public transport planning, at least in theory, and also competition, although it's competition for the market through competitive tendering. Very much not competition in the market like we had with deregulation. Auckland in New Zealand is an example of a city where there was a relatively deregulated bus system, somewhat akin to the UK arrangement outside of London, but which has recently shifted to this kind of proactive planning by a government authority with competitive tendering with service contracts. And it seems to be considered to be a relatively successful arrangement. So let me just recap where we've been. We talked about deregulated bus systems where the government takes little or no responsibility for the outcomes. Then there were the passive franchises where the government took a little bit more responsibility for outcomes, but not enough to make sure that things went well. Well-regulated franchises, government was taking a little more responsibility and keeping an eye on things, but nevertheless the private sector operators were the ones to take the initiative on change in the public transport system. Next, in terms of more government taking more responsibility, is proactive planning with service contracts, which we just talked about. The government takes responsibility for the planning of the system and the scheduling of the system, but private sector operates the actual services. And in a public monopoly arrangement, the government is presumably taking all of the responsibility for the system. It's in their basket. So these options differ in what kind of competition is possible. Deregulation has competition in the market, which creates some problems in many ways. Competition for the market is usually considered to be preferable, but we can see that the franchise versus the proactive planning with service contracts arrangements are quite different in how that works. And of course, public monopoly arrangements, there's little or no competition at all. Deregulation and the passive franchises are not really compatible with strong coordination. Well-regulated franchises, coordination can be better, and in some cases it can be very good. But if you really want really ambitious coordination of your public transport system, government probably has to take even more responsibility, and you need one or another of those options where government is doing the planning, whether it's public monopoly or the proactive planning with service contracts. I've been using some names for these options that are not necessarily universally used. UITP, the International Union of Public Transport, uses some terminology which is a little different. Deregulation they call open entry market. The franchise options they call authorization regimes. What I call proactive planning with service contracts they call delegated management. And public monopoly they call direct management. But more or less they're talking about the same things. Let me end with a little bit of a detour into a slightly different issue which overlaps here, which is the question of regional integration. Public monopoly, public sector operators, in theory, its government is taking full responsibility, and in theory, it's compatible with excellent coordination. But in practice, we very often have uncoordinated, fragmented sets of operators across a region. So a dramatic case of that is the San Francisco Bay region, where there's a huge number of different public sector operators that don't necessarily coordinate their services. So a trend that started in Germany and has spread throughout Europe is for the creation of transit authorities or public transport authorities, in Germany called Verkehrsverbunds, that coordinate at a regional scale. So Hamburg was a pioneer in this. Zurich is a famous case of a regional Verkehrsverbund, public transport authority, that coordinates many, in the case of Zurich, public sector operators and treats them more or less as contracted out private sector operators would be treated in other contexts. And so some of the best public transport systems in the world are with well-coordinated transport authorities that do the planning and delegate through contracts to many operators, some of which may be public sector operators, some of which may be private sector operators, and it actually doesn't really matter. The key ingredient for success is this transport authority and its responsibility for the coordination. And there are variations in how exactly this works. But this is a big opportunity, but also a big challenge. Depending on where you are in the world, it may be very difficult to create a regional public transport authority. If you're in a country that's lucky enough to have very large metropolitan scale cities, such as China or India, then the city scale of government can handle much of this responsibility. In Europe, the more common thing is for these authorities to deal with many different local authorities. And for some reason, they've been able to manage this coordination that is difficult in other parts of the world. There seems to be a trend towards this alternative of having a public transport authority planning proactively and strategically and in a highly coordinated way and being ambitious about public transport, but very often delegating to the private sector or at the very least coordinating several public sector operators who then are willing to cooperate and coordinate with this regional public transport authority. Various places around the world are converging on this option. In the West, it tends to be the starting point is various public monopolies. So moving to this new option involves creating a transport authority at the regional scale, and very often it also involves privatization, so-called. And to be specific, the particular kind of privatization that we're talking about here is contracting out. In other parts of the world, the common situation is that either coming all the way from deregulation, like in Auckland, or coming from a franchise starting point, like in Singapore or Seoul. So it's coming from the opposite direction, where this represents an increase in the responsibility taken by government. So time will tell. Will this be a successful trend? Will this be a long-term trend of a convergence towards this option? I don't know. Another big question which I'd like to deal with in future episodes is how can cities that currently have almost totally unregulated or relatively unregulated bus or minibus systems like Manila's or most of Africa's cities, how can they improve their public transport? What are suitable steps in the direction of improving reliability, improving comprehensiveness, improving coordination, but without undermining the existing strengths of those systems and without harming the employees and harming the people involved? who are often in precarious situations and are really vulnerable to having their businesses disrupted. It seems to be a situation that is extremely difficult to reform and improve on. And I'm really keen to hear about places that are taking steps and seeing some success. So that's it for this episode. This topic is often considered to be a very dry topic, but as I said, it's worth paying attention to. These choices have really big and important consequences. So it's important to wrap your head around the options here and to go beyond simplistic dichotomies like government or private. I'll try to provide some links to some deeper reading on this in the show notes. Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.